Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this morning to discuss the upcoming, well, currently ongoing and upcoming cannabis licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. My name is Jerica Perez. I'm a partner here at Vicente in our Denver office and have been with the firm 11 years or so. I lead our national licensing practice with Brian Vicente and focus on limited and competitive licensing. So I've done these types of licensing processes all over the country and in Canada, outside of the US. Thrilled to finally see USVI get off the ground when it comes to actually licensing medical and adult use businesses. It's a very exciting time. I think the rollout this year has moved fairly efficiently. We'll get into details and talk more about that here in a bit. I'd also like to give my co-speakers the opportunity to introduce themselves. We have Andrew Livingston. Andrew, I'll let you go first, and then Key, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jericho. My name is Andrew Livingston. I'm the Director of Economics and Market Analysis at Vicente. I've been with the firm for about 13 years studying cannabis markets in the United States and globally. This is not my first crack at the U.S. Virgin Islands, as there's been a lot of interest over the last decade or so, first in medical, now in medical and adult use. And really excited to talk to everyone about kind of what to expect from a business opportunity going forward. And I'll pass it over to Key. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. So my name is Kay Walker, and I practice law in the Virgin Islands. I was involved in the efforts to have our current Cannabis Use Act passed finally, as well as in the drafting of the rules and regulations that are being implemented by our Office of Cannabis Regulation. So I'm excited to be here to discuss what we have going on in the Virgin Islands, and I'm available to answer questions as needed.
Thanks, Key. A little bit about our firm. You may or may not be aware, our firm, Vicente LLP, since 2010, has primarily focused on cannabis, hemp, and psychedelics law. We've helped thousands of clients, as well as governments, navigate, develop rules, laws, regulations regarding regulated cannabis and psychedelics programs all over the US and beyond, as well as federally. This is sort of our specialty. We've been doing it a long time. And like Andrew said, he's been doing these market analysis and financial projections in all of those jurisdictions and beyond for the last 13 years. So excited to finally get to talk about USVI. We'll kick it off with a bit of the background. I think Key is certainly best suited to discuss that, as she has been on the ground and in the weeds. So Key, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. So the passage of the Virgin Islands Cannabis Use Act comes after years of effort. We do have a somewhat conservative population in the Virgin Islands, and it took a lot of work to convince the legislature that they needed to pass this. There was a slow run with the passage of the Medical Cannabis Use Act, and then we were able to get recreational use passed as well. So now we're adult use and medical. I worked on behalf of the Office of the Governor to get the legislation passed, and I spoke to almost each and every senator, of which we had 15, about this. And I think they are consistent in that they were seeking to have implementation or rollout of a program that was safe for the community, number one. And number two, that provided economic opportunities for residents of the Virgin Islands. And that's why you'll see with our Cannabis Use Act, we've got a pretty robust residency requirement. We have tried our best to make sure that we created opportunities for local residents to not just apply and be awarded licenses, but to also work within the industry. So social equity is a very important part of the Virgin Islands rollout. The Office of Cannabis Regulation is a new agency created just because of the medical and adult use legislation that had passed. There is a board of local members, and there is a director, and she has a somewhat slim staff right now. She's continuing to staff up as they commence and continue with the rollout of the program. The rules and regulations have been passed. They're in place. The OCR is following it, and I think the starting point for anyone who's interested in participating in the program is to read the rules and regulations and be very familiar with it, as that's going to govern the licensing process.
Definitely. So this slide is just an overview of the different types of licenses and permits available. You'll see cultivator, manufacturer, dispensary, research and development, and testing facility are all license type. And then we have what I'll call like an ancillary permit, right? Your adult use lounge permit, cannabis use and temporary use permits, on-site consumption, and micro cultivation. We'll talk a bit how those interact with or are separate from and when I say these, the permits interact with or are separate from these licenses for cultivators, manufacturers, dispensaries, testing facilities. As you've probably understood by this point, this is a competitive merit-based licensing process. We have a robust scoring rubric and specific requirements for each license type's application, as well as a very specific scoring system and rubric. And we can talk a little bit more about the rollout of this application process if you have started looking at cultivation, and we can actually switch to the next slide. As Keith said, I believe she said cultivation licenses are actually available right now. Cultivation and dispensary, we have set limits for each of those by island. Those limits are listed here. There will be no more than this number of licenses given. So they could decide to give fewer than these. They don't have to give all of these licenses, but this is the max number of licenses that will be distributed during this licensing and application round. They will be reviewing the number of licenses and the need for more licenses in the future. But as we've seen in most all markets, and Andrew may discuss this too, I do think it will be some time before we see additional licenses beyond these.
That's correct.
So let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So cultivation applications have been released, as well as micro cultivation applications. Those applications were initially due on June 6th. That deadline has been pushed back to the 30th. OCR said that all other applications are to be released shortly and no later than June 30th. That is certainly not a hard deadline anywhere in law or rule that has been set. So it is certainly subject to change. And I think, as we've seen this program roll out, a lot of the timeline has been TBD. So assuming, let's say that they actually do release dispensary applications, manufacturing applications by June 30th, law requires that the deadline be at least 60 days after the release of that application. So the earliest deadline we would see for those applications, assuming they're released on June 30th, would be August 29th. And then per rule, they are allowed 90 days for evaluation of those applications and award announcement. That's a fairly short window for review and award of licenses in such a competitive environment and a robust application. We'll get into those application requirements here in a bit, but they are significant. It is certainly one of the more robust merit-based applications we have seen. I will key anything else on those basics before we have Andrew jump into the market analysis, and then we'll go back into the application requirements, ownership and residency, all those nitty-gritty details.
I'll probably say this more than once during today's program, but the social equity component is huge. There are bonus points that can be awarded for that, and I think the OCR will be looking for robust social equity programs, ones that include the hiring of residents, ones that include the training of residents. So, you want to, no matter which application you're submitting or which license you're applying for, you want to make sure that you pay special attention to that.
Absolutely. All right. Next slide, and Andrew, we'll let you give us the market analysis for USVI and what we can expect to see.
Thank you so much, Jericho. Thank you, Key. So let's dive into a little bit about what the island looks like, and what are we thinking in terms of size of population, market size, and so forth. So for those who aren't as familiar with the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Thomas and St. John are quite close together, and St. Croix is much further south. Key, how far of a boat ride is it from St. Thomas to St. Croix? So it's a
That's
couple
a
hours, right?
It's an hour and a half ferry ride, and it's about a 15 to 20-minute flight.
Flight. Okay. So it's a little bit of a ways, whereas St. Thomas and St. John are not a stone's throw, but much, much closer. And most of the population lives on St. Thomas and St. Croix, and they're relatively similar in terms of population. St. Thomas is kind of where most of the cruise ships come in, and has most of the tourism, with I would say um, more of the population that is less tourism based in St. Croix. In terms of population size, in total, we're looking at about this is 87 thousand people or so. And there has been a decline in population since the 2010 census. So the 2010 census, I think we were about 106,000 in population, and it's declined since then. But still, we're looking at a reasonably large size population, or small but a reasonable population on St. Thomas and Croix, with a much smaller on St. John. But obviously, the most significant revenue potential, if you're looking at this from an adult use perspective, is with tourism. So we'll be touching on that in a moment. Next slide, please. Um, so, in terms of the local population, let's talk a little bit about that before we get into this tourism. Um, Most of the, more of the population is older. So about 28% of the population is 40 to 60, about 29% is over 60, with a, smaller population that is both under 20 and under 40. So, in total, if you're looking at, what percentage of the population are of legal age, we're looking generally at um, around 80% of the population, a little less than that. What is it? 78.2% of the population. Um, U.S. Virgin Islands, has poverty issues, has is a underprivileged um, population generally, has not had the same resources as many U.S. states, and while there is money in tourism in certain places, it's obviously there were some hard hits during COVID period. And the median family income is $52,000. Approximately 22.8% of the population is below the poverty level, and that's based on 2019 data. And so there has been obviously some hits since then, with the way that the tourism, but some of that, as we'll see, has kind of rebounded. And there was only short periods of time when cruise ship tourism really did not hit the U.S. Did not go to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Um, and so, the cost of living is in some places less, particularly in St. Croix, than it is in certain states. And so, this is a population that, I think when we're looking at the domestic population, is obviously a significant demand for medical and adult use cannabis. But it's important to ensure that products are being created for the demographic of the population, right? There will be obviously probably a pretty significant bifurcation in the types of products produced and sold, both in quantity per package, for tourists and non. And we'll jump to the next slide for a second. I'll talk a little bit more about tourism.
And so sorry, Andrew, real quick can we jump back to the last slide?
Yeah.
you just talk a little bit about how the demographics the economic demographics in USVI have played into this focus on the social equity program and for maybe, for example, like the micro cultivation permit and what that means for the program?
So I'll touch on it briefly. Since 2010, we've had the closure of the largest refinery in the hemisphere that was located on St. Croix. So that was a huge reason for why the population decreased. People had to leave the territory for opportunities. And then we have people who are unable to leave the opportunity for territories for one reason or another. So the legislation, the rules and regulations are targeted towards creating economic opportunity for the local population and education and training for the local population. Because one, in addition to providing those opportunities, we have to provide an incentive to leave the Black market as well. So that is a major part of the program. I think a successful application will need to include something that addresses that. And that would be a major selling point to the CAB and to the OCR director and should definitely be considered.
That's helpful. Go
Thank you,
ahead.
Keith. No, that's really great insight, into a lot of the rationale for why. And that's, it's clearly important when we understand if we're applying for a application and we are not from the community. If you are not closely partnering and have an individual who is, a resident in the U.S. Virgin Islands and, as a partner and an owner, you're just not going to get a license, right? Obviously, we've talked about social equity, we talked about residency requirement, but it's even more than that, right? It's not, to really obtain a license like this in a competitive application, and we've seen this in different U.S. states, but I think it's even more important in a community like the U.S. Virgin Islands that this needs to be really by and for U.S. Virgin Island residents. So let's talk a little bit about tourism. So, there's been, happily some significant rebounds in tourism since 2021. There's some period of time before then during COVID when there was some, wasn't really much cruise ship activity. And the way that the tourism data is shown is a combination of St. Thomas, St. John, and then St. Croix. As we can see here, if we look at cruise and air travel, most of this stuff is cruise ship passengers, and most of that is excursionists, in which they're there for a single day. So that's important because, people are going to go, hopefully off the boat, visit the island, tour around for a little bit, go on a little bit of an excursion, maybe go snorkeling or something like that. They're not going to have a lot of time to purchase cannabis. And so convenience will be key if you're looking to take advantage of those cruise ship passengers. In 2024 on St. Thomas and St. John, we saw, over 2.25 million cruise ship and air travelers, with about 1.5 million of those being cruise ships, and another million being air traffic. So the air, they're going to be there for a little longer. And this is adjusted. So we're looking at this in terms of daily, right? So the number of actual passenger arrivals and things like that for um, and I'll show that in how that impacts the market analysis in the next slide. So, air travel, they're going to be typically there for longer. And so depending on where you are, I think that if you're not right near the cruise ship ports and you have a dispensary, probably be more air travelers than it will be cruise. St. Croix is significantly less than that. So not quite a tenth. But in comparison for 2024, we're looking at 2.25 million travelers to St. Thomas, St. John, and only 355,000 or so for St. Croix. And most of those travelers are to St. John, are to St. Thomas, with I think fewer to St. John, but depending on the excursion, you might go there for snorkeling or things like that. That's why it's combined. It's also important to recognize that there are significant seasonal dynamics. That's to be expected, right? Like, people typically want to go to the Caribbean when it is cold in the United States, or cold in Europe. And so we see a lot of traffic in December, during the holidays as well as January. And that kind of dips off into April, May, June, July, and your lowest months, it's gonna be reversed to what it is in a lot of places in the States as far as cannabis sales, where your lowest months are likely going to be June through October. So that's important to think about when analyzing for staffing, and analyzing for what your sales trends look like. The next slide. All right, now let's talk about some market size. So the important thing to note is there are no recent surveys on cannabis use rates in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They're not included in the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. They're not included in the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is a CDC study. And there isn't many local studies on cannabis use rates. So we don't really know what those cannabis use rates look like in the U.S. Virgin Islands. From speaking to people in the past, I know there's a lot of a home grow culture, more so in St. Croix than there is in St. Thomas. There's obviously or you may or may not know, but there's a significant cultural cannabis use with the Rastafarian community, and kind of just the heritage of U.S. Virgin Islands. But we don't really have data on the different use rates amongst different segments of the community or different ages of the community. So if we look at 18 and older national use rates, which was about 16.11% of the population for residents, and I used past year at about 23% for tourists, we end up with about 7,433 resident consumers. And when we look at annual equivalent tourist consumers, and this is for this, I took excursionists or this cruise ship and estimated they were there for a single day, and took air travelers and estimated they were there for 3 days. We end up with about another 2,300 or so annual equivalent tourist consumers. So there's obviously going to be big differences depending on what month you're in. More of those are going to occur in the essentially the winter months in the United States, or it's not all tropical, but weather is much nicer in the U.S. Virgin Islands in December than it is in Colorado. So in total we're looking at about 10,000 or so between St. Thomas and St. John. And in St. Croix, a little bit less than that, about 6,600 or so resident consumers, and only about 457 annual equivalent tourists. So there we're looking at a little more than 7,000 consumers, and that assumes again 1 day stay for cruise and 3 day for air travel. So what does that mean in terms of market size? Um, you know, it really depends upon what people are purchasing and how much they're purchasing. This is difficult to know, because it's going to be, we're going to have to really kind of see for future regulations about what it looks like for purchase size for non-residents, or, the amount that really these tourists can, what percentage they're coming in and buying. Because that's really dramatically going to affect what the revenue and the total market size of U.S. Virgin Islands looks like. So thank you. Next slide.
Thanks, Andrew. And you can go back to that slide. Key, I just have a question for you. We're about to talk about this robust residency requirement, right? And the requirements for that and ownership and all that good stuff. And you may or may not know the answer to this, but generally, having been a resident in USVI, do you expect a lot of the black market cultivators and who are selling marijuana to transition to the regulated market? Are you guys seeing interest from a large number of residents that intend or want to do that?
Well, I'll say this, the government has taken steps to incentivize anyone in the black market to transfer over. They've offered automatic expungements of criminal records. They have offered training because, of course, the black market doesn't have regulations like the market that's being rolled out now. It remains to be seen how many transition over. So that's a difficult question to answer. I do think that we could be successful in transitioning people from the Black market so long as we incentivize them and provide opportunities for them. An example of that would be the type of benefits that are offered to employees of licensees. You're not getting health insurance when you're in the Black market. So things like that may prove to be an incentive for people to move over. Robust training programs would be helpful as well. So I encourage anyone who's interested in applying for a license to consider those types of programs in their application submission.
Got it. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the details of the application and requirements to hold one of these licenses, starting with general ownership and disclosure requirements, and then Key's going to talk a little bit on the next slide about the residency requirement. So as we've said multiple times during this webinar, and if you have any interest in these licenses, you probably already know, there is a majority resident ownership requirement for these licenses. This is not a one line in the rules or a one line in the law. This is a theme that is present throughout the law and the rules. This majority resident ownership requirement is for the life of the license. It is not for the first year or the first 3 years. You cannot get a license renewed if you do not have that majority ownership, 51% or more residency requirement met, and you actually have a reporting requirement for any reason that you may not meet that requirement anymore. For example, the removal of an owner, the death of an owner, addition of new owners, anything like that. So they are taking this very seriously. Key can talk a bit more of that. They have also very much expanded on the definition of owner, financial interest holder, permitted interest, indirect interest, and what those mean. So we've seen a robust interpretation of ownership here, which I think when we're looking at a residency requirement in a social equity program, that's important, right? We know what they're talking about. Owner is defined as someone who owns any share of stock or membership interest. This includes all officers, directors, members, partners, and any person who's in receipt of or has a right to receive any share of revenues or profits derived from the business that is not a financial interest holder. Importantly, they've said that majority ownership interest, so it's not just holding equity, but it has to be otherwise controlling 51% of equity interest, voting rights, and profit interest. So they're not accepting of any sort of sham equity arrangements where perhaps you have an investor who's not holding any equity directly in the business, but receiving all of the profits. That's not going to cut it here. All of that does have to be disclosed in the application, and it is specifically defined in rule and law outside of equity to include voting, to include profit interest. Financial interest, I think this is an important one to define too. Any right or entitlement to any portion of revenue or profit from the sales of cannabis that would include a reasonable royalty, right? So you're looking at like IP licensing agreements and things like that, or a permitted interest, which is really just an option agreement for an interest in the future. I think someone asked the question I saw in the Q&A, is there a limit on the percentage of ownership an outside investor can have or a number? So, you could say 49%. That said, it's going to entirely depend on how that investment is set up as far as the loan and how the profits are going to flow, how that loan is going to be paid back. The corporate structuring here, if you're going to have non-resident owners or investors, is likely going to be complex, and it needs to be clear for the regulators when they're reviewing these applications. They have said no pub co-ownership and no ownership structures that would make it too difficult or unreasonable for them to see through to who owns, every interest in the business, who's receiving every profit, and where the funds are coming from. So they've made that very clear. They're requiring all disclosures of all financial interest. Personal information for all owners is required, which is what we see generally if you've started looking at that form. I expect they'll probably follow up with requests for additional information as well, since the form online is quite simple. There's also requirements, obviously, for everyone to be over 21, no disqualifying felonies. Those are laid out in law. You're required to disclose civil litigation history for the past 10 years and all convictions, as well as the source of funds. Source of funds is actually one that's made it into the simplified form, requiring social security number and explanations for all sources of funds that will be used for the business. And we can switch it over to residency requirements. I'll let Key take the lead on that and talk a little bit more about what the expectations are here.
So the residency requirements, of course, are pretty strict. You have to have resided here out of the 10 of the last 15 years. You could be deemed a resident if you attended school here for at least 5 years, graduated from high school in the Virgin Islands or from the University of Virgin Islands, that you have to be registered to vote here. There was a concern by at least one senator when this was passed about students who had to relocate because of hurricanes. They wanted to make sure to capture those people as well. So you also would have graduated a high school but relocated temporarily due to natural disaster. So ideally, what an investor should want to do is partner with a resident that definitely meets these requirements. Prior to submitting an application, you want to have definitive proof that the resident or residents that you have partnered with definitely meet these. If they have not lived here for 10 out of the last 15 years, you're going to have a problem and you will be disqualified. So that's important. The micro cultivators, the requirement is less. They must have at least lived here for at least 3 years, and no less than 7 years of cumulative residency. And residency is a requirement, a continuing requirement. So when you submit your renewal applications year after year, the residency requirement will then again be investigated. So that's a significant portion of the application. There's no workaround for that. And you just want to make sure you partner with the right people.
Got it. And Key, in your opinion, if you're able to speak to this, has OCR, because having done this in so many different states, we've seen these residency requirements be challenged and litigation happens. It goes on for years, but generally they're not upheld. But has OCR and, the legislators, are they prepared for those issues? Have they really thought that through?
The government of the Virgin Islands is prepared to defend the residency requirement and the social equity requirements or bonus points. It's something that came up repeatedly in discussions. The case law in other jurisdictions have been monitored. We have spoken to lawyers, and both the executive branch and the legislature are standing by the residency requirements. So should it be challenged, it will be defended strongly and aggressively.
I think that's good to know. And before we change slides, a couple additional things I want to touch on here. Somebody asked about changes of ownership, and I think that's important when we're talking about these residency requirements. I've talked to quite a few individuals and groups who are interested in applying that think the residency requirement only lasts for 1 year, because there is this provision in the rules that discusses changes of ownerships being prohibited in the first year, which is correct. Any majority change of ownership is prohibited during the first year of the license unless it's necessary due to death or something like that. So regardless of if you're still meeting the residency requirement, there is a prohibition on any majority change of ownership within the first year. That does not mean that the residency requirement is only for the first year of the license. Like we have said, it is for the lifetime of the license. There's just a prohibition on any majority change of ownership within the first year of the license. One thing that we haven't touched on either that is not entirely clear in the rules that we've received a lot of questions about, a little bit of a gray area here, but we have talked to OCR about it, is the ownership of multiple license types or multiple of the same license type on one island. The latter of which is not explicitly prohibited, but we are talking about a competitive, evaluated application here. They have made it very clear they do not want the same owner or the same group of owners owning more than one of the same license type on the same island. Vertical integration is permitted. You can own the same license type on a different island, but not the same island. So I do think that is something to take into consideration. We'll talk a little bit about co-location here in just a bit, but I do think that's an important point for people to be aware of. Next slide. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the application requirements. If you've looked at the rules, then you are aware we have what I'll say are clear, robust application requirements for what they want to see in this merit-based application. I don't know that I would say the same about the actual application. If you've looked at the application online, it is a fairly simple form. Some of these things are included in the form fill-outs. It's an online form. It does say, I think like employee training plan is one of them. If you're looking at the rules, you'll see that employee training plan also includes like an employee handbook. They get into a lot of detail in the rules about what the expectations here are for the submissions and the applications. Not as specific, when we're talking about a fill in the blank form online, right? So keep that in mind when we're talking about these categories. Most of these categories we've seen in competitive applications, merit-based applications everywhere. These are sort of the general things that we've seen. I'm sure USVI based these requirements on what has been successful and required for jurisdictions with competitive applications in the past. Business plan being the first one, right? Relevant experience, qualification of the applicant's team, pro forma operational timeline. One thing, our motto here is that you've got to have the Holy Trinity if you want to win one of these applications, and that's team, property, and money. And I think what we see here as far as the requirements in USVI reflect that same thing. The pro forma, the application team all being required in the business plan. That's a big portion of the points at 150 points. Those are themes that you're going to want to include throughout your entire application. Andrew has put together tons, I would say maybe hundreds, thousands of these pro formas over the years for these types of applications, as well as realistic operational timelines for cultivation. You do, and we'll talk here in a bit about these specifics, you actually do have an operational timeline requirement. So you're required to begin cultivating in a certain amount of time. All of your operation plans are required. Suitability of facility and premises. This is important because you are required to have a property in order to apply. That's a huge cost, right, up front for a license that you may or may not receive. We'll talk a bit more about property requirements here in a bit. Employee training plan, security and record keeping plan, product safety and labeling, emergency plan, and the optional social equity plan. We'll talk a bit more about those details here in a bit. But importantly, like I said, there's fill in the blank form online, and then there is a portion of the application where you can provide attachments. Since this is a competitive application, our expectation is while the basics of your response are going to be in those forms, you are going to provide, or we would recommend you provide, significant attachments for each of these sections in the attachment section of that application form, right? We want to see what your labeling is actually going to look like. We want to see what your employee training plan is going to look like. Your operational plans, what do those SOPs look like? If you want to be competitive, you need to show that you know what you're doing and that you're prepared to operate. When it comes to the pro forma and the money, they're not saying you need to show $2 million in liquid capital in order to get a license. But again, this is a competitive application. So having a reasonable pro forma that is based in practice, previous practice, and historic fact is important here, right? And then you need to be able to show that you have the capital to operationalize this business. And then you need to be able to disclose the source of funds for that, because we do know they're going to ask for that. We expect they will ask for more information. We talked about deadlines earlier. By rule, they have the ability to request any additional information they want when evaluating these applications, and you have 10 days to respond. So you should be prepared for that. They can allow you more time depending on the scope of the request, but generally you're going to have a 10-day response requirement for requests for additional information. Next slide. So dispensary application, a bit different than cultivation and manufacturing. We're still looking at a scoring rubric here, but business, financial, operating, and floor plans are actually all together and worth 300 points of the application. We're still seeing similar things like the proforma requirement, the operational requirement. There's a specific section for applicant knowledge and experience, which is 200 points. If you remember from looking at cultivation and manufacturing, that was actually kind of under the business plan, which was only worth 150 points. So it's even more important here. And then you're still seeing your security and record keeping plan, emergency plan, and then your social equity plan. But I do think the expectation is, you have a security professional, you understand the unique geographic security issues and considerations in USVI, the community that you plan on being in, as well as the emergency plan, right? Because this isn't, I'll say like Boston. There are actually unique geographic emergency issues in USVI that will need to be addressed in your emergency plan. And we expect competitive applicants will work with a professional on those as well. We are happy to provide, and again, we'll give our contact information at the end of this, but we've already drafted thousands of these and have thousands of pages of IP. But of course, it's important that you're making these narratives and plans specific to USVI, the team that you're going to have in USVI, and the very robust rules and regulations in USVI that are unique to them. Next slide. So Key, I'll let you talk a little bit about the social equity portion of the submission here. Again, to be competitive and to really increase your chances of getting a license, I think this is absolutely, while optional, a necessary component of the application submission.
And that's correct. So you're looking at a total of about 1,000 points. And then the social equity plan gives you an additional 150 points. One of the things that's very unique to the legislation in the Virgin Islands is that we have sacramental use. We're the only jurisdiction that allows for sacramental use, and we have a very active Rastafarian community who also is seeking to obtain a dispensary license. Partnering with anyone from that community or from an organization of that community would qualify for social equity points. You also have, of course, other individuals, in addition to Rastafarians who've been somehow negatively impacted by the criminal justice system. You've got veteran-owned entities, you've got female-owned entities. And when you think about how you structure your team or how you structure the company that applies for the license, you can qualify under the residency requirement and still receive social equity points by partnering with the right individuals. So you can consider that as you're looking for who you're going to partner with in the Virgin Islands to apply for the license. And there are individuals and their organizations who would meet both. So this is a huge part of the application process. I encourage anyone who's interested in applying to take it seriously. We have a max amount of dispensary licenses that will be issued, but I think what you should take away from Andrew's portion of this presentation is that the coveted licenses are really the ones in St. Thomas, those dispensary licenses, because of the huge tourism numbers. There are times where St. Thomas is the #1 cruise destination. And since COVID, the tourism, the cruise tourism has increased significantly, and it's getting close to the pre-COVID levels. So if you're going after one of these coveted licenses, you want to be well informed as to the amount of time that individuals will be spending on the island. You want to be cognizant of what type of experiences they're looking for. Tourism, we've noticed in the Virgin Islands that, in the past, cruise ship tourists would shop. They'd go to the main street and they'd shop. Now they're looking for experiences. So what type of experience could you create, and how could you include your local partners in creating those experiences? So anything, any language like that, anything that will show that your business, especially if you're a dispensary license, you're meeting the residency requirement, you've thought about and you've included social equity in your program, but also how are you advancing the tourism product? Especially in St. Thomas, all of those components will be very important in any application, especially for that St. Thomas dispensary license.
Very helpful, Key. Next slide. So as we've talked about, property is required for all license types to apply in USVI. This means that you are required to submit proof of possession. We want to see a lease. We want to see if you're going to have something where you're not going to have current possession of the property, our recommendation would be that any sort of purchase agreement or contingent lease, the only contingency be the receipt of a license. Proof of that, and I think it's likely they'll ask for more additional information here. In the application, they haven't gotten into detail about what they want to see, but it's very clear in law that they do want to see proof of possession. And these things are graded on a sliding scale, right? Best case scenario is you own the property outright and it's already built out. Probably not likely for 99% of applicants, but that's best case scenario. And then of course it's a sliding scale down from there to a purchase agreement or a contingent purchase agreement, lease, contingent lease, and so on and so forth. Floor and site plans are required for the actual exterior of the site as well as the interior. Of course, we would strongly recommend, and to Key's point, showing that you've really thought through the experience, how your business is going to fit into the local community, the tourism community. What is it going to look like, right? We would recommend you have interior and exterior renderings as well as just basic diagrams. And then, of course, there are zoning restrictions for these types of businesses, as well as setbacks separate from the zoning. So none of these licenses, and when I say none, I'm specifically talking about cultivation, manufacturing, and dispensary, but nothing can be located within 250 feet of a school or a house of worship, and nothing within 250 feet of the perimeter of any cruise ship bearing dock or pier in the territory. So when you're looking for property, which is required, and I know property can be difficult to obtain in USVI, you need to keep those in mind, as well as the specific zoning restrictions, for example, for cultivation. It's permitted in areas zoned as A1, A2, R1, and R2 as a rule, but then zoning beyond that will be determined on a case-by-case basis. You can reach out to I think it's the Division of Natural Resources. I could be mistaken. Department of Planning and Natural Resources, I think, for additional information on zoning, at least for cultivation. And that's a very important part of the due diligence you should be doing before you lock down a property and apply for one of these licenses. Next slide, please. So we've included a few license-specific considerations here. We'll go through cultivation, manufacturing, as well as dispensary. One important point that has been a topic of discussion since this program began is intra-island transport. And if you look at the rules, cultivation licensees, manufacturing licensees, dispensary licensees are actually limited to transporting on the same island. They can't transport from island to island. But beyond that, there's other considerations between the islands and transporting between those islands. For example, transporting for testing, right? Key, can you talk a little bit about the issues there and if we can expect any resolution, if you know? Oh, and you're on mute, Key.
So the OCR has indicated that it is working on a solution. It has identified a solution. I don't believe that it has announced the solution as yet. And this is a solution for transporting between the islands for purposes of testing. So for those who may not be aware, the water is between St. Croix and St. Thomas, and even St. John and St. Thomas are under the purview of Customs and Border Protection. So to allow for transport, you would have to have a waiver, which the Virgin Islands does not have. But the government working with the OCR has been working to identify a solution, and I, don't know what the solution is, but I've been assured that there is one and that it will be announced in due course. So I think that issue regarding testing has been resolved for the most part. I think as the program rolls out, there will be additional solutions that will allow for transportation, but not initially. And this is a test case for us. So what's going to happen is they're going to evaluate how the rollout is going. They're going to look at, consider any risks for allowing the inter-island transport, and they may be able to negotiate a waiver that would allow for that transport under certain circumstances. But as you apply for this first round, you should keep in mind that there is there's no inter-island transport allowed, but it will be allowed for the testing based on the solution identified by the government. And I think that's because the government will control the testing to some extent, and that's why there's a solution there.
Got it. In addition to that, specific considerations for cultivation, you will need to include what tier. There's separate tiers of amount that you can cultivate. You'll need to include that in your application, as well as the methods of cultivation. Are you indoor? Are you outdoor? You are required to begin production within 6 months of receiving a license. So, we'll all be on the edge of our seat to see when these dispensary applications are released. And we get manufacturing and dispensaries up and rolling because of this 6-month production timeline for cultivations. There's also a specific cultivation tax of 50 cents per gram of cannabis. Next slide, please. Manufacturing considerations. So again, limited to same island transport. I did include some of the product and serving limits in here: 100 milligram THC product limit, 10 milligram edible servings. I mentioned earlier that you could be vertically integrated, right? That said, so you could be vertically integrated, but for both manufacturing and what we'll see here in just a second in dispensary, there are requirements for sourcing of materials that they will be checking on a monthly basis that you are required to comply with. For manufacturing, every month you have to demonstrate that 70% of your source material came from an unaffiliated third party. In addition to that, you have to show that 15%, you've sourced 15% of your inventory from a micro cultivation each month. So depending on the availability and use of these licenses, they could make exceptions to that rule, but this is the expectation, and OCR will be reviewing this on a monthly basis. And you'll be required to show that through Metrc, your inventory tracking system, every month. At dispensary, sorry, next slide, please. So dispensary considerations, again, limited to same island transport. We do have open restrictions from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. You can obtain an adult use lounge permit, and I think this is very important for what Key said. What kind of experience do you plan to offer? For an adult use lounge or consumption, while a dispensary can hold one of those permits, it does have to be a separate premises, right? So maybe you have a neighboring unit or an upstairs unit. It does have to have its own entrance and exit. And so it can't be necessarily co-located with your dispensary on the same premises. They can't just be wide open to each other, open floor plan, for example. There are also daily purchasing limits for dispensaries that differ between residents and non-residents, as well as inventory requirements for sourcing similar to what we saw for manufacturing. 70% of your inventory has to be from an unaffiliated third party. You'll be showing that every month. You'll be required to set a wholesale acquisition price if you also hold a manufacturing. So if you hold a dispensary license and you hold a manufacturing license, you do have to set this wholesale acquisition price. That has to be designated for each product, and it has to match the wholesale acquisition price that the dispensary charges when distributing that same product to other dispensaries. So that's an important point as well, to sort of control this vertical integration permission that they've allowed. You're also required to show that 15% of your inventory was sourced from a micro cultivation each month. Again, you'll be showing this through your inventory tracking system, Metrc. And then fees and taxes. So 18% sales tax, there's a patient exclusion for this. And then there's a non-resident cannabis fee for every purchase of $20. So when we're talking about tourism, that's going to be an important aspect of this. Otherwise, dispensary, there's nothing too crazy as far as dispensaries are concerned, or cultivation or manufacturing. It's really our general requirements. But I do think these are some unique things that people should be aware of and prepared to address within their application narratives. Next slide. So micro cultivation licenses, we've talked a little bit about these micro cultivation permits. Micro cultivations do have a plant cap of 50 flowering plants and no more than 200 immature plants. So this is a fairly small license. You're not allowed to hold a financial interest in any other license type if you hold a micro cultivator permit. That is not, we've just discussed you could be vertically integrated if you're a regular cultivator, manufacturer, dispensary. That is not the case for a micro cultivator. You are required to have a valid farmer's license or an application for that license in process. One license per applicant. You cannot hold multiple micro cultivation permits to try and increase your canopy space. And you have to begin cultivating within 2 months of receiving the license. There is a lower residency requirement here, 7 years cumulative, but at least 3 years together. And then these are going to be granted on a rolling basis to individuals or entities with a USVI business license. Key, anything else to add on the micro cultivation front?
I think you've covered it. With regards to the sourcing, I'm sure you all can see the intent behind that, and that is to make sure that the opportunities presented from the rollout is available to as many people as possible. So that is definitely, I think, the key intent and policy behind that. Thank you, Jerica.
Yeah, and we are out of time. I know there were a number of questions we didn't get to. Please feel free to follow up, and we'll try and respond to you. There are not page or word limits on attachments, by the way. And I know there were a lot of other questions. I apologize we didn't have the time to get to them. Here is our contact information. We offer our full suite of services for these types of applications at Vicente. We have a fantastic corporate team, and of course, Andrew, our economic director. And we hope to have the opportunity to continue working with Key. It's so important that you have a USVI barred and licensed attorney to work with on some of these very unique and complex issues. And she's the best there is. So don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Thank you all so much, Andrew, Key. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, excited to see this program roll out through the end of the year and hopefully see some businesses start opening in USVI soon. Hopefully I get the chance to visit.
Thank you, Jerica. And just to be clear, the deadline for the cultivation license is June 27th. I think someone pointed that out. So we just want to correct that date. It's not June 30th, it's June 27th.
Thank you for that, Keith. All right.
Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.